Coming Around Again by Gwyn Chapter 3. That day in 1931, the morning of perhaps the hottest day that August, the silica dust glittered on the grass and on the pavement and on the railings bordering the lawns, giving the whole of Earlson Way a lethal edge. Small flashes of light, following the incline of the hill, worked up and down the street as if someone were turning a knife in his hands. "Hey, hey, give me one. Give me a high one." 6 boys played hardball in the sun that August morning, posturing in the light as the ball flew or was caught, approving or disapproving the style with which the moves were made. It was already hot, so hot that they had to mop their foreheads. Where they had wiped their palms on their pants, there was a dust-colored smudge, an ochre-colored smudge, representing the mills which powdered everything they touched in the valley, even the boys playing baseball in Manessa in the morning on the damp earth. The idea of work that summer, something to work, was an obsession in the valley which was between jobs. Even playing baseball had begun to look like work. That morning, Sarah and Ruth strayed up the mill road, outside the boundaries that now separated them from where their friends still lived. Notably idle girls that August, they were convalescing, delivered from the hot rooms where their mother wept and mourned. They were just come from the cool of the salon of the Sharps' mortuary, where they looked with practiced reverence at the photograph of the Sharps' only son, killed at Ypres in the Great War. They had sipped, even at that early hour, genteel iced tea in sweating glasses, sitting in the white wicker porch furniture on the Sharps' veranda, careful to keep their knees together, being tutored in the exercise of grief by Mrs. Sharp, a matriarch among mortuarists. They were convalescing, agreeing with Mrs. Sharp's dictum that time is a healer, even where their father's death was concerned. They finished their tea and walked up the slope to the hill's crest. When they turned, looking down at the slope behind them and the mortuary on top of it, Sarah had said, "That's our undertaker." Saying it that way comforted her a little. She was 14 at that time. She and Ruth had crossed the street to Roger's house, avoiding eye contact with the ball players who ignored them. Ruth, drawn to dignity with the seriousness of not looking at the boys, ran her hand along the railing bordering the sidewalk, which coated her palm with fairest dust, and she observed that now she couldn't scratch her nose. She was almost 17. "Roger thinks he's smart," Sarah said, looking at the boys' moves. "Roger is smart," Ruth replied. She was at the age when she sort of liked Roger. They climbed the steps to Roger's porch and rang the bell, their feet printed on the damp wood floor. "I've got some kittens, look," Roger said through the screen door. "Oh!" The girls made soft, whiffling noises at the little blind things they saw moving in the shoebox Roger held in his hands. "We were just about to put the poor little things out of their misery," Roger said, running his glasses back up his nose with his index finger. "What do you mean, Roger?" Ruth had asked blankly. "So if you don't like it, you can just go on home." "You're going to kill them?" "Well, we can't raise them," Roger replied crossly. "Their mother was run over, and they are too little to raise by hand." "What do you mean, Roger?" "Grandmother wants to drown them," Roger said. There was a moment when the 3 of them contemplated the awfulness of this idea and the grandmother who had suggested it. "But I am going to gas them. Gassing is the most humane way of bringing about death. You can help with the experiment if you promise not to get silly and cry all over the place." "Couldn't you raise them by hand with an eyedropper or something?" Ruth asked. "No, we just can't, Ruth." Roger looked out of the screen at them bleakly. They knew that, too, was not his own idea, even though he shrugged as if he was indifferent to the kittens and what happened to them. Roger was left behind with his grandmother, while his mother tried to make it on her own in Pittsburgh. Left behind in Manessa, he had to be his grandmother Tui's boy. "Are you going to stay or what?" Roger demanded. "You can help with the experiment if you stay." It was that promise of helping, of making something work, that got them. "If you really let us help, we'll stay," Ruth said. "We won't cry or anything," Sarah promised. So Roger unlatched the screen and led them through the house and out the back door, where Mrs. Toohey's garage, white as a Mediterranean villa, stretched across the whole yard. "What do you want with them two girls?" Mrs. Toohey asked when she saw them. She was fussing around her Pontiac, which nuzzled the August air from the shade of its stall. It nuzzled Mrs. Toohey as she came around its side. She squinted to see them in the light. Mrs. Toohey was 72 that summer. She had been old in Manessa for 20 years. She was humoring her grandson, Roger. Because of his supposed intelligence, she was humoring him regarding those kittens. But now that she has seen Ruth and Sarah coming into it, clearly she regrets that fact. "Your mother know where you are?" she asked, squinting into the light. "Seeing them? You big girls?" "Yes, she always knows where we are," Ruth lied, feeling childish. "They are going to monitor the experiment," Roger told Mrs. Toohey. "Now watch the box," he abjured Ruth briskly. "I'm going to get the tubing." "You should be home giving her a hand." Mrs. Toohey ran her hand along the car hood and then across her apron, rust tracked in the flour. Sarah looked at Ruth. How could we help? Her look wondered, and then she bent to see the exhaust pipe and exactly where the tubing would go, just as if she was a young scientist witnessing an experiment. Mrs. Toohey looked at her. "You just wait until you've lost your man, like Em did," she said. It was useless to add that Ruth and Sarah had in fact lost a father when Em's man died, so the three of them fell silent, waiting for Roger to appear with the tubing. "I should have drowned them like I planned," Mrs. Toohey said, looking at the box with the kittens inside it. "They don't know any better." But Roger appeared at last, a length of black tubing in his hand. He waved at his grandmother to start the Pontiac and drew out his Barlow pocket knife. "Now, I'll just cut a hole here," he breathed. Ruth held the box while the knife went in. In the box behind the tubing something might have mewed, but before anyone could be sure, the box was put on the floor. The hose was connected to the exhaust pipe. The lid was sealed and weighed, and the timing began. Mrs. Toohey started the car at Roger's signal, and there was a sheen of the exhaust in the air. And Ruth and Sarah moved to the edge of the sunshine in the garage, holding Roger's watch, timing. 3 minutes, Roger said. Roger even had it timed to be humane. And when the time was up, Mrs. Toohey turned off the engine of the Pontiac. There was a silence in which Roger tried not to cough, and Mrs. Toohey chafed silently through the windshield of her car and waited for release. Ruth and Sarah were the ones to witness, and they ceremonially lifted the stone from the shoebox lid and stripped away the tape and looked. "They're not dead yet," Sarah said, a little muffled from the bending. "You didn't give them enough time, Roger," Ruth said. She stepped away from the box, moving around it, staring at Roger. "I did too," Roger said back, moving too, squaring off, his lips pouched out. "You're going to have to kill them all over again." Ruth was so angry that she began to cry. Though normally she didn't cry, now the tears rolled down her nose. "Is that what happens now?" Sarah asked. "Are you going to kill them all over again?" No, I'm not," Roger said, but looked as if he was baffled, as if he didn't know what to do. "He's not going to do any such thing," Mrs. Toohey cried, furious with all of them. "Give me them kittens, and I'll drown them like I planned." She climbed out of the car and started towards them, and for a moment they were all held up on the morning shine, completely beyond timing. Mrs. Toohey made the first move in that light. She grabbed for the box, determined to solve them kittens once and for all, and Roger leant into Ruth to defend his grandmother's move and to see what Ruth was going to do about it. Only Sarah didn't have a thing to do. She fanned the paper with her fingertips, not knowing what to do. "I'll take them," Ruth said, her voice husky with emotion, "and I'll save them." "Oh, no, you won't." Roger lunged for the shoebox. "Stop, you," Miss Toohey cried, trying to block Ruth's way. "Come on," Ruth cried to Sarah, taking the box and running around Mrs. Toohey, and the two of them tore across the cement driveway, across the next yard, through a buzz of bees and goldenrod and poison ivy, all the way to the Episcopal Cemetery, where they stopped, skinned, torn, splayed on the newly cut grass and breathing hard. Well, we showed them, Ruth had panted. I thought that Roger's grandmother was going to kill us, Sarah puffed. It was awful. Is Roger going to come after us? And their heads lifted, sensed the air, anticipating Roger through those weeds, those hot gardens. He won't come. He's got no wind, Ruth decided. Then there was a long silence between them, filled with their breathing. What are we going to do with the kittens? Sarah asked. We'll raise them, Ruth said with certainty, with an eyedropper or something. Let's go home. A discussion followed. What if Mother won't let us? She will. But when Mrs. Toohey tells her, then we'll have to give them back. You know how Mother is. She won't let Toohey have those kittens, no matter what, Ruth finally said, reaching over for the shoebox. And the two of them drew together, low in the Episcopal cemetery, and lifted the lid. Each in her own way expected a resurrection, expected the happy ending this time. But they saw almost immediately that the kittens really were dead, that, after all, they had surrendered to the timing. All that, and we didn't save them. And then they cried for the kittens, and for each other, for the fact of the kittens again, and for whatever else they had feared on the lethal edge of that particular summer. When they stopped finally, it was on the simplest and most practical of problems. What to do with the bodies? What can we do with them, Ruth? Bury them, I guess. They looked around. They were already in a cemetery. On either side of them were tombstones, little horns filled with dead flowers, wreaths, a potting shed, an iron bench beside the walk. But in that entire cemetery there was no soft dirt, just tombstones and thick grass. And below them, heading for the back door of the church, there was a woman. Duck, we're going to look pretty silly if she sees us, Sarah observed. We're way too old to be doing this kind of thing. That summer her measure was all in age correctness. Still, they crouched over that shoebox like guilty thieves. Daddy's grave will still be soft, Sarah whispered, when the woman went inside and the coast was clear. He'll still be pretty soft anyway. Sarah, Ruth was shocked. Well, he will be. He's only been in the ground a month. You're probably right, Ruth agreed. Let's go. There was a real adventure in the ducking down and the edging around markers and the crawling along, all of which stained their knees and their dresses with grass stains and ground stains and mill stains, on the lookout for the woman who had gone into the church. There he is, Ruth said finally, for he had been buried well to the far side. Just James Preston Hilton. Birth and death on a stone, and below the stone a mound of dirt that really was still soft, and some bouquets of dead flowers that stank and stuck to their fingers when they moved them away. Poor Daddy. What did he finally look like after the accident? Sarah asked the question. Like nothing, I guess, was the response. They wouldn't even let me see him because of the accident. Because of the accident. For a moment they thought about the accident. Because of the accident at the rolling mill, an error in judgment, they called it, because error and machine had combined so hugely and horribly, their father, James Hilton, had to be laid up in a closed coffin, while his children were encouraged to look at the sepia photograph before them in the funeral home, the photograph of the Sharps' only son, killed at Ypres in the Great War. And James Hilton's wife, Emily, their mother, had not even that consolation, and had to watch the Reverend Dewborn speaking over the coffin with his hands, it seemed, holding the lid down, though of course he was not holding the lid down on the coffin. He was simply holding, pressing on the canvas, while he spoke of the resurrection and the life. Was there anything left of Daddy, really? Sarah asked her sister. I wish I could have seen him. I would have liked to know how he looked. I guess there had to be something left to bury, Ruth replied. She too felt strange about not knowing. What if he doesn't like cats? He'll just have to make do. They put the bodies in the hole they clawed out of their father's burial mound, curling the kittens against the ground, and of course, there were more tears as they pushed the earth back over the fact that there had been nothing of their father to look at. The lady reappeared in time to witness the little touches they were giving to the dirt over the kittens. What are you doing? She cried. What are you doing? Let's get out of here, Ruth said. She won't understand. And of course they got away all right. They ran, expecting her always a little bit behind them, expecting the worst from her. Ruth tripped and nearly fell. Sarah skinned her knee, getting over the stone wall. But they both got safely over, and they turned and saw the woman stooping down and stirring the dirt on their father's grave with her fingertips. "I bet she's going to think what we did was bad," Ruth said. "She's probably going to think we killed those kittens and then just buried them." In the end, it was all a question of timing, made easier by the fact that the hill had crested downward, and they ran away from the woman in the cemetery all the way down to the river road, stopping, finally in front of Eastleigh's ice cream parlor. The window had a black band painted across the bottom half. It had reflected their moves in obsidian, a kind of dark mirror. The river road was always empty at that time of the morning in front of the ice cream parlor. Down at the steel hall, the men gathered to sign on for work, but Ruth and Sarah had the window of Eastleigh's ice cream parlor to themselves. Standing so, they looked dramatic, poised. "You know your dress is torn," Ruth said to their reflection, making a droll mouth. "You look like someone tried to bury you," Sarah said back. "Look what I found," Ruth said, producing what she had fallen over and picked up in the escape. "It smells terrible, doesn't it?" she said, breaking the dirt away. "Oh, Ruth, let me see." In the black light, even dirty, the gun shone. Sarah took it and posed it. "See how it looks, Ruth? I think it's a real shooter." "I guess it's real." Ruth took the thing back, sighting it, scratching at the dirt around the hammer with her fingernail. "What will we do with it?" Sarah asked, looking through the reflection at her sister. "Whatever you do when you got a gun." Ruth smirked and pointed. "Bang," she said to the mirror. And their reflection was in a dark band with the daylight behind it. "What will Uncle Lute think if he's already there and waiting for us to come in?" Sarah said, seeing them as she imagined Emily and the mysterious Uncle Lute would see them. "Mamma said we are going to have to impress him with our ladylike manners and such." "Maybe he won't notice," Ruth said, because she could see from their reflection that there was no pretending away their appearance. That was something their mother would notice. "Maybe he's not there yet," Sarah said, ever the pragmatist. That moment in the dark mirror showed them together poised, the hills all around them, and the sun turning in its shine. Ruth and Sarah watched who they were in the dark glass before they turned away and walked the rising street to the apartment that was now their home, arm in arm, ready to meet their new old Uncle Lute.